Good morning, Robyn. It's great to see you today.
It's nice to see you too.
And I also know that you're an Indigenous social scientist, but I also love to hear about it directly from you. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and the work you're doing?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Ani Bojo Kwekwe, Robyn Rowan Indigenous, Wabi Makwan Indodem, Temiogaman Indonjaba. Hi, my name is Robyn, and I'm a First Nations woman on my maternal side with mixed ancestry on my paternal side. I'm a registered member of Matachewan First Nation and a hereditary member of the Temiogama Anishinaabe, which is along Lake Temagami in northeastern Ontario. I am a mother of four, and doing the work that I do is really made possible because of the support I have from my wonderful partner, Chris. I hold a master's in Indigenous Relations, a PhD in Rural and Northern Health, and I began university when I had a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old, 2 daughters at home. I did my 4-year undergrad, my 2 years of a master's, a 4-year PhD, and I did all that without any pause. I graduated officially in June of last year, 2022. And so those same two are now 12 and 15. And I also have a 12-year-old stepson. And of course, partway through my PhD, I needed the added challenge of becoming a mom again. And so I also have a 3-year-old daughter. A little bit about my PhD journey. I really began exploring 5 centuries of capital and consumption-led economies that were really drivers in assimilating, dispossessing, and colonizing Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that I focused on was the historical extraction and its moves through to modern day forms of data extraction. And so I was introduced to some international folks in and around, I want to say 2017. And we were really doing some big thinking around Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. And I really fell in love with that space. So I participated at that time in the development of the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. So that's about collective benefit, the authority to control, responsibility, and ethics around doing respectful Indigenous data use. And so working with all of these international thinkers around that time, we also launched the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, which I sit on as an executive member. And so throughout all that time, the work that I was contributing to in the Indigenous data sovereignty space eventually led me to having some really big questions about the future of data extraction. And so I spent most of my time looking back and thinking about not just thinking about the past, but I was spending a lot of time thinking about the present. And so I started to read and learn about technological advances and what that would mean for the future. And I started to see a really kind of an urgent need to make some space for myself to do some of that bigger thinking. So I began a postdoctoral fellowship, which is something you do after you do a PhD. You can go back and learn some more. And so I'm doing a postdoc at Queen's University. I started that in August of 2022, just after I graduated. So I am now a qualitative social and health scientist researcher in the School of Computing at Queen's in the Department of Biomedical and Molecular Sciences. And so the official title of my postdoc is Indigenous Digital Rights, Decolonization and Data in AI, which is artificial intelligence. So it's been really interesting focusing on data from this sort of social justice perspective in this really kind of hard sciences space where not everyone is thinking in the same way. But at the same time, it's really given me the opportunity to learn from them and with them and to see how things work. And so I've really learned that data work requires multiple mindsets to get to the best outcomes. And so at the moment, I've been focusing most of my attention to embedding the goals, the priorities of Indigenous data sovereignty into research spaces where those discussions are just not as common. So recently, actually, I attended this big data conference in the US where the focus was on cancer research and AI. And I was there with Indigenous data sovereignty as my platform. And I spoke about Indigenous people's inherent rights within data spaces, within big data, cancer and AI spaces. And I was telling my colleagues that I felt, really out of place having these big conversations. And I was the only person there speaking about Indigenous people's rights. But I was pleasantly surprised at that conference, because on my way home, some people had to stay behind and I had to leave because I was driving 8-hour drive into the US. And I heard from a colleague that I had won an award for outstanding impact in data science. And I was really excited about that, not because I won, but because winning meant that despite what I thought, people were really listening to what I was saying and what I was sharing in that space. So that was pretty exciting. And yeah, so that's some of the things that I'm working on at the moment.
And in your website as well, you talk about having these conversations, sharing these knowledges. And on there, a specific section in particular really drew my attention. It's where you said, I am always looking for ways to share the knowledges that I have gained over the last decade with Indigenous nations and Indigenous organizations who are interested in better understanding the world of research and data. So this is going to be kind of repeating some of what you said, but to delve a bit deeper into that, I wanted to ask, how would you define your methodology and approach when acquiring and sharing this knowledge?
Yeah. So I really aim to advance decolonial and anti-colonial and anti-racist pedagogies in the work that I do. And to explain this, I've had a pretty interesting career. I spent years trying to advance work for First Nations in particular, because I work primarily with First Nation communities and organizations as a First Nations woman. But I spent years trying to advance health priorities that I believed, based on the literature, based on the research, that these were issues that needed my focus. And so I was doing a health PhD, a health-related PhD. And so I was really focusing on specific health concerns, mental health concerns. And at the beginning of my PhD, I began doing a project on mental wellness with First Nations. And I found that while I was doing this work, I was really feeling drained. And it felt like a sort of uphill project is how I describe it. Everything I was doing, I always felt a little bit like I was getting tumbled backwards. And so while I was doing this work, I was also working with these international partners that I mentioned, doing this Indigenous data sovereignty work, which for me began as a passion. And I was working and writing about these things off the side of my desk, outside of my PhD work initially. And so the interesting thing that I found for me was that when I was working in this space, when I was working in spaces that I felt I shouldn't be working in, that the universe had a way of drawing me towards the things that I was supposed to be doing. So I didn't really pursue Indigenous data sovereignty. It sort of pursued me. And I relate my journey sort of to the experiences of a river flowing wherever the current kind of pulls me. And the same is true for my current work. I believe that to be part of the way that decolonial research is done, you really need to just kind of let the river pull you where it needs to pull you. And so I used to work really hard to make my way through projects that felt uphill. And I realized one day, water doesn't flow uphill. And so if I get a sense that something feels off, I really have to listen to my inner self and listen to the universe who's always guiding me to where I'm supposed to be. And so I approach my work from the perspective that this is always bigger than me. It's not about me or the things that I want or the things that I think that I want. It's about the importance of building connections, creating relationships, and respecting that the river has a destination for me. And then I need to give and take within that river. And I function sort of from a personal methodology or pedagogy that really aligns my sense of responsibility for working for communities with the relevance of the work that's needed in communities. And it's not always easy, but I really hold myself accountable for providing guidance that's rooted in real life. And so that can be uncomfortable for some people, can be uncomfortable for me at times. And particularly for community partners who may not have a strong understanding of that history of extractive, resource heavy impact that has influenced the past, influenced the present, and will continue to have influence into the future. But one of the things I find when I'm, from my own personal perspective, is that I don't dwell too much on the things that don't work out. If a project doesn't work out or a relationship doesn't work out, I know that there's a reason for it, even if it's sort of beyond my understanding. And so I try to teach in that way, and I try to learn in that way.
On the topic of health priorities, as you said, building connections in the process, tailoring it to that community, I wanted to ask about the dangers of not doing that. So, for example, what are the dangers of a singular identity speaking on behalf of an Indigenous collective? For example, what does Indigenous-led research and data initiatives bring that cannot be replicated by this singular identity?
Yes. I think history has really shown us what the dangers are of a singular identity speaking on behalf of any collective, let alone an Indigenous collective. We've seen the impacts. We've learned what that history can look like. And so for me, I've discovered that the journey towards learning is really endless. And so no one person knows everything. And I think that the more you learn, the more you unlearn, the more that you realize how little you actually know. So having the opportunity to work with communities and being in spaces with so many different thinkers, so many people with different perspectives, elders, knowledge keepers, youth, even working with academics and scholars from across different disciplines with different backgrounds, socially, academically, it's really, really essential to gaining a full picture of the world around us. And the same is true for Indigenous-led research and data initiatives. I think it's important to have sort of a shared interest or direction, but that interest could look different depending on whatever the work you're doing is. But say, it's maybe your shared interest is dismantling systems of oppression, but one mind could not possibly understand the full scope of the social, political, economic, ecologic, the histories or the future agendas that are sort of at play. So a gathering of minds is really needed to see the full image. And the same is true for researchers who do research on behalf of, or maybe even with, Indigenous peoples and communities. There are systems at work in everything researchers do, whether it's something like a funding agency where there's a tight deadline or strict budgetary restrictions around capacity or community relationship building and development. Maybe those dollars are inflexible and they may be allotted towards specific research tasks and areas. For instance, the data could tell us that certain communities need mental health resources, mental health research to occur, perhaps because there has been an increase in poor mental health outcomes in that community. So you have this allotted amount of dollars to research funding around mental health. But until you actually spend time with the people or spend time in that community, you may never know the reason for those outcomes. Maybe it was related to a respected community elder who passed away during the pandemic, and due to COVID restrictions, the community was unable to bring that elder home or have an appropriate burial or an appropriate ceremony following that elder's passing. And this perhaps created a deep sense of loss and tragedy in the community, increasing those mental health rates. So we're looking at the numbers, and the solution might be that there needs to be more flexible funding that enables the communities the ability to grieve in the ways that matter to them, or maybe it's something else. But from a sort of policy perspective, from the people making the decisions on how dollars are spent, they are just seeing, oh, mental health rates are on the rise, therefore we need to do research into mental health. And so policymakers don't always know what's actually going on, and the people deciding how much funding to allocate, they might not have that full picture. So only the people living in the community, the people that need to be part of that collective, part of those conversations, know this. And so as Indigenous peoples are sort of seeing statistics, these disparaging data in the research that tells community members things that we already know, it doesn't help to actually correct the deeper issues that really continue to hamper our human and Indigenous rights. And so that's why we need those multiple voices, because we need those multiple perspectives.
Yeah, this this season of the podcast, we're focusing on methodology. That's why I wanted to learn about these from you, especially the approach of working with the community, working with the voices that actually experience them. And this is a conclusion question that you already kind of addressed, but I also wanted to get more of a strict answer towards the end of the episode. A very blunt question, so I'll just throw it at you. Can methodology revise history?
So no. If you're looking for a blunt answer, no. I think that like for me, I view methodology as a personal and sort of philosophical position that people take when deciding on their research methods and their approaches. And so the importance is really, it lays with the ways that people think about doing research, not so much the methods that are chosen. So can methodology revise history? If you mean, can methodology be used as a way to think and relate differently to history and its repercussions on the present and the future? Yes. But if you view methodology in the way that I just described it as something, as a tool that can be used or a way of thinking that can be used to advance the way you do work, but in terms of can it revise history, I don't think that, as we know, we can't really change the past, but we can acknowledge the ways that it is often written, not always in the best interests of Indigenous peoples. And by doing the sort of hard work that's required in uncovering what the truth is of the past and connecting that to the present, that could definitely lead to a clearer understanding of the intricacies of the systems that are at play. And so, data scientists, for instance, they use data from the past to make predictions about the future. And so if that's the way that we use data, then we most certainly need to ensure that we understand the past that led to the creation of that data in the first place.
Yes. So I guess at least revising our perceptions. I see. Thank you. And turning this, since we're students and this is a student-run podcast, kind of turning this to us a little bit, what can we as students learn from Indigenous-led research and data initiatives? How can we incorporate it into our work at this stage of our lives?
So again, I'm going to give you a probably a long answer, but Indigenous peoples, they're beyond resilient. Wiesner calls it survivance, and the perspectives that Indigenous peoples have. It's not simply that Indigenous peoples have survived, right? This idea of survivance is that we have survived with many of our languages, cultures, traditions intact, and so we continue to hold respect for the sacredness of traditions, and most importantly, the land. Recently, I heard an elder say, I don't stay in my reserve because the life I live here is great, because he recognized the hardships of living in the community and having limited access to resources and infrastructure. But he stays in the community because of his sacred responsibility to protecting the land. And so that idea of survivance, despite the personal sacrifice that's being made to ensure that the land is protected, is something that I think we all need to be thinking about. So when you're doing your research, when you're doing your work, one of the things I learned throughout my postdoc, I'm personally working to understand the environmental impacts of modern and advancing technologies and what that means for data. And so, for example, the consumption and extraction of natural resources, earth, metals, minerals, electricity, water, carbon emissions, all for the advancement and creation of technology. And I think that in all the work that we do, if we really want to advance Indigenous priorities, acknowledging and making changes that reflect the impact of technology on the environment is really the most important thing that all of us can do. The earth has taken care of all of us for millennia, and it's our turn really to make sure that we're doing everything we can to take care of her. If everyone worked together to develop greener, more sustainable processes that ensure that the earth can continue to survive as technology evolves, things like reconsidering the size of that database you're about to use. Do you need it to be that big? Do you need to duplicate it? Reconsider things even at a student, as a personal level. Do I need to replace that laptop or cell phone, which is really just creating more technological waste? knowing where your information is housed and how it's being stored, how your data is being stored. For instance, the virtual cloud, it's not some beautiful green space. It's using a massive amount of resources. And so when you're thinking about advancing Indigenous priorities in research, whether that's around data governance or around data sovereignty, no matter who you're working with, whether you're a student or you're not a student, we all really need to take pause to further consider the repercussions of climate changes that are resulting from greenhouse gas emissions and tech waste. Ensuring that everybody is educated or educating themselves on these matters, I think is really important.
Episodes like this are one of my favorite things of being able to do this podcast as well, like talking to people that are on the field doing the work and willing to share it with us like you. So thank you very much for being with us here today.
Miigwech.